Hey guys, tonight we going to tumble through time and land squarely on the polished stone floors of a medieval Spanish courtyard where music thrums in the air, skirts swirl, and dancers make thunder with their heels. Unless, of course, they're unlucky enough to be wearing the wrong socks. Yes, you heard that right. Tonight is all about the curious, suspicious, and occasionally tragic tale of why certain socks were feared by medieval Spanish dancers. There's silk and sweat, superstition and scandal, and enough collective foot trauma to make a podiatrist wince. You probably won't survive this if you hate itchy wool or historical gossip. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough to type, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in 14th century Castile, where music is thick in the air like honey, and the scent of sandalwood and sweat weaves through the dancers' cloaks. There's something magnetic about the sound of heels against stone, the sudden hush before the next beat drops. But no one's looking at the instruments or the singer. They're staring at someone's socks. A dancer at the center of the floor, poised and elegant, wears a pair of socks dyed a pale saffron yellow. You hear the whispers, quiet at first, then louder. "She's wearing those socks." One old man near the wine jug crosses himself. You squint. They look like ordinary socks. But apparently, in this particular court, those socks are anything but ordinary. Historians still argue whether the fear surrounding specific sock styles stemmed from religious symbolism, a practical safety issue, or widespread performance superstition. But the unease was real. Some dancers refused to rehearse near anyone wearing problem socks. Others carried tiny charms in their shoes to ward off bad sock luck. Mainstream fact? By the late 1200s, Spanish court dancers were respected professionals, and their wardrobe, including socks, was often provided or regulated by their noble patrons. And one thing the patrons didn't want: a dancer face-planting during a diplomatic dinner. It turns out socks were a surprisingly complex part of dancewear. Some were knit from coarse wool, others sewn from thin silk, and still others imported, expensive blends from North Africa or Flanders. But not all socks were created equal. Some dyes, like certain sulfur-based yellows or coppery greens, were known to irritate the skin or even cause blistering when mixed with sweat. Quirky fact: there's a 132-33 merchant ledger that lists 2 bolts of dancing cloth not for socks, causes itching. And yet dancers kept using the stuff, because it looked good, and in a culture where performance was everything, political, romantic, sacred, you didn't wear socks for comfort. You wore them for the illusion. Slim ankles, elegant feet, daring embroidery, it all mattered. You edge a little closer to the dancers. You can see how the wrong sock might slide inside a leather-soled shoe, causing imbalance, or how certain weaves might restrict the flex of the ankle. A misstep in flamenco or jota can be costly, not just to your pride, but in a court full of enemies, to your entire career. One famous dancer, La Cintilla of Zaragoza, reportedly slipped during a dramatic finale while wearing tight-weave blue hose. She cracked her wrist, lost the king's patronage, and was later seen hawking oranges at the city gate. Did the socks ruin her? Or was it just a bad night? Historians still debate that one. But you can see how fear builds. Not from one accident, but from dozens, each whispered about behind cloaks and fans. A few twisted ankles turn into a rumor. A few rumors become legend. And suddenly, an entire generation of dancers refuses to wear olive green socks on feast days. Your feet itch a little just thinking about it. And yes, people tried to fight the fear. Scribes and scholars rolled their eyes at sock phobia, noting that no such thing existed among warriors or monks. But dancers, perhaps more than any other medieval professionals, lived in a state of ritual, repetition, precision, Every element of their appearance, down to the color of a thread, became a part of their performance magic. You lean against the stone wall, watching a new dancer step into the circle. Her socks are crimson, trimmed with gold. The audience murmurs approvingly. Someone slips a coin to the musician. The fear has passed, for now. But you can't unsee the way the first dancer keeps fidgeting with her ankle. Her saffron socks slip slightly on the tile. You brace for impact. Luckily, she recovers. The performance ends. Applause echoes into the starry night. But the legend of the socks has already been sealed in gossip, and likely in some noble diary. And so begins our slow dance through the bizarre, delicate world of Spanish sock lore. You adjust your own blanket, curl your toes a little, and try not to think too hard about what's in your laundry basket. You trail behind the dancers as they vanish into a stone corridor where their footsteps echo and their silk hems whisper against the walls. The performance is over, but your curiosity is just waking up. Something about those socks, so small, so seemingly harmless, has your imagination snared like a loose thread catching on a nail. To understand why dancers in medieval Spain began to fear certain socks, you have to step back, way back, to when socks weren't even called socks. In 13th century Iberia, foot coverings came in many names and forms: calzas, medias, and even the occasional botines, little booty-like wraps made from whatever scraps were lying around. You picture a young apprentice dancer sitting on a stone bench, threading together two scraps of woolen cloth, poking her fingers more than the needle. These weren't the comfy cotton socks you're used to pulling out of a drawer. They were scratchy, hot, and stiff, like putting a piece of rug on each foot and calling it a day. Mainstream historical fact: early sock-making in medieval Spain involved felting or loosely knitting wool, sometimes layered with linen for comfort. But the materials were often unrefined. The wool could be laced with natural oils or even remnants of lanolin, and dyes were unpredictable. One dye derived from walnut husks could cause the fibers to stiffen so much that dancers joked they could stand their socks upright. And here's a quirky tidbit for you: some dancers would leave their socks under their mattress for a week to soften them with body heat and pressure. Romantic? Maybe. Gross? Definitely. Effective? Not particularly. But here's where things turn from uncomfortable to uncanny. It was said that some socks, especially those dyed using saffron, weld, or madder, caused strange itching fits during performances. Not ordinary itching, not, "Oh no, I forgot to moisturize." We're talking uncontrollable stomping, twitching legs, and, on one rare occasion, an impromptu spinning episode that ended with a dancer vomiting behind a tapestry. Historians still argue whether this was due to poor hygiene, allergic reactions, or the psychological power of expectation. You wear a pair of socks everyone says are cursed, and suddenly every tingle feels like a warning. The line between discomfort and dread blurs quickly when your body is your career. Add to this the very real concern of heat. Dancing in thick woolen hose under the Mediterranean sun? A health hazard. Dancers risked heat rashes, dehydration, and sweat-slick soles that could send you flying mid-twirl. In fact, one merchant record from Seville in 1298 notes a sudden spike in demand for imported silk socks to prevent slipperiness and discomfort among court entertainers. A noble way of saying, our dancers keep falling, and yet dancers kept wearing them. Or rather, had to. In many noble households, dancers' wardrobes were issued by their patrons. You were told what to wear, how to move, and which socks matched the occasion. Refusing a specific pair, especially one woven with gold or displaying a family crest, could be seen as disrespect. Some even whispered that disobeying a noble fashion instruction could curse your entire lineage with flat feet. You're 80% sure that's not medically possible. But hey, it made them nervous. You find yourself imagining a young dancer slipping on a pair of heirloom socks moments before, performing for a visiting French ambassador. The fabric's stiff. The fit is wrong. One toe pokes through, but she dares not protest, because the Countess chose them. And just before the music begins, someone whispers behind a fan, "Those are the same socks Inez wore before her ankle twisted." Cue the nerves. The dance begins. One wrong step. The prophecy fulfills itself. The fear of socks became self-fulfilling. And like any good superstition, it evolved with every retelling. A hole in the heel, a sign of romantic betrayal, a twisted cuff, bad luck for your second-born child, red stitching, a mark of vanity, white linen, acceptable only under moonlight. And hear us a particularly strange nugget. Some dancers began to sew tiny herbs into the cuffs of their socks, lavender, thyme, rosemary, to protect against foot curses. Imagine trying to perform a perfectly timed heel stamp while your right sock smells like a chicken roast. Eventually, some dancers began to craft rituals around their socks. One kiss before putting them on, a 3-turn spin before each performance, a whispered prayer to Saint Vitus, patron of dancers and sufferers of neurological disorders, just in case the socks were possessed by something more than friction. You reach down and tug your own blanket. It doesn't itch, thankfully, but now you're hyper-aware of your feet. You wonder how many dancers in medieval Spain tried to fake a twisted ankle just to avoid wearing a particular pair of scratchy horrors, and how many of them actually believed the socks had a mind of their own. Your feet shift under the covers, the ghost of old wool brushing your imagination. The corridor ahead grows darker, but the path remains clear. You move deeper into the dancers' quarters, where the scent shifts from sweat and sandalwood to wax, damp linen, and something a bit more mystical. Clove, perhaps, or dried juniper. There's a heavy trunk in the corner, cracked open, revealing a riot of rolled-up stockings, ribbons, and foot wraps. But no one's rummaging through it casually. The dancers approach it like it's booby-trapped. You soon learn why. You overhear one of the performers muttering, "Not the stripy ones, not tonight." And you realize that the sock suspicion wasn't just about materials. It was also about patterns, colors, even stitching styles. Welcome to the tangled knot of closet superstitions. Among elite performers, especially those dancing at royal or ecclesiastical courts, superstition and wardrobe became tightly wound. Mainstream fact: the medieval Spanish courts were deeply ritualistic environments where gestures, dress codes, and even colors could have layered meaning: political, spiritual, and personal. Dancers were expected not only to perform, but to embody symbolism. Wearing the wrong sock could imply arrogance, rebellion, or disrespect, especially if you accidentally matched the coat of arms of a rival house. One anecdote preserved in a 14th-century Valencian diary tells of a dancer exiled for mocking the crest of the House of Trastamara by wearing diagonal stripes in silver and blue. It wasn't a joke. It was seen as a coded insult. You tilt your head. Was it political performance? Or was it just laundry day? Scholars still argue whether this obsessive caution stemmed from genuine belief or performative paranoia. But the dancers clearly bought into it. Entire styles of socks were gradually phased out from performances. Vertical stripes, said to cut the fortune. Zigzags invited ankle injury. Embroidered roses on the toe supposedly invited romantic betrayal before year's end. You can't help but laugh, imagining a dancer blaming their breakup on their footwear. But superstition ran deeper than love life woes. It intertwined with performance luck itself. Dancers believed in good foot days and cursed foot days, and many thought it started with the first item they touched in their dressing basket. One sock reaching your hand before the other? Lucky, but if you accidentally grabbed the left before the right, doom. And it gets more layered. Some dancers believed certain fabrics harbored the energy of previous wearers. They avoided borrowed socks, fearing they carried the ghost of failed routines. You picture two dancers arguing over whose sweat was luckier. "I slipped once in yours." That was the floor. A quirky fringe practice emerged from this: the sock blessing ritual. Before major performances, some dancers would light a small taper and pass their socks over the flame, briefly, to cleanse them. Others placed a sprig of rue, a pungent magical herb, inside each cuff. One troupe even hired a foot scribe whose job was to track each dancer's sock use and correlate it with performance outcomes. You imagine an entire medieval spreadsheet scrawled in Latin: Maria, yellow hose, 2 stumbles, mild applause. The nobles weren't blind to this either. Some fed into the sock superstitions for entertainment. At a wedding in Córdoba, a countess reportedly gifted a dancing troupe a dozen pairs of mismatched socks as a challenge of grace. The dancers were horrified. One fainted. The performance went ahead anyway, and rumor says 3 people got engaged during it, which either broke the curse or proved socks had no power at all. But logic rarely wins in the dressing room. What's more, these elite performers weren't just tiptoeing on the edge of fabric anxiety, they were also managing the silent politics of fashion hierarchy. More ornate socks meant higher favor. Simpler socks meant you'd better dance like your life depended on it. You try imagining auditioning for a noble household, only to be judged by the width of your embroidered cuff. Still, there was power in reclaiming the rules. Some dancers leaned into the sock lore. They'd perform barefoot on holy days to prove allegiance to the saints. Others wrapped red string just above the sock line to cut off the curse. And in one bold move, a group of Seville performers wore matching black socks for a week to honor a lost troupe member, and in doing so, turned black from a mourning omen to a mark of solidarity. This act shifted things. Suddenly, sock superstitions weren't just about fear, they were also about agency, community, and the delicate rebellion dancers could pull off under watchful eyes. When you can't speak against power, you let your feet do the talking. The trunk closes with a groan. The last dancer laces her sandals over plain gray hose, modest, blessed, boring. She's playing it safe tonight. You can almost hear the mental checklist: no stripes, no foreign dyes, right sock first. You realize these performers weren't just dancers. They were curators of myth, managers of unseen forces, and survivors of fashion politics more tangled than any tool. And somewhere beneath all the fabric and fuss is a simple truth. When your performance, reputation, and livelihood depend on every movement you make, even a sock can feel like fate. The room hums with quiet tension now. You follow the dancers as they exit the quarters, walking single file past a row of taper candles flickering against cracked plaster. Each flame dances gently, like the very air understands what comes next requires reverence, or possibly protection, because tonight isn't just another performance. Tonight is a festival, and festivals mean new socks. Out in the stone-paved courtyard, servants hurry by with trays of food, flagons of spiced wine, and, yes, stacks of neatly folded legwear, each pair bound with dyed ribbon. These are ceremonial socks, reserved for special feast days, religious festivals, or the arrival of foreign dignitaries. And if you think regular dance socks caused panic, wait until you see what happens when protocol meets polyester's great-grandfather. Mainstream historical fact: medieval Spain's festivals were sprawling spectacles of faith, politics, and performance. Religious processions, marriage alliances, royal anniversaries, each came with its own rituals. In Andalusia, dancers would perform during Corpus Christi with layers of costume that shifted depending on whether the procession was led by clergy, guilds, or nobility. But no matter the occasion, dancers were expected to embody joy, reverence, or grace, all while tripping around in ceremonial socks that often hadn't been worn since the last solstice. You'd think the biggest danger was slipping on a dropped grape. Nope. It was being assigned the wrong socks by the wrong person at the wrong time. Imagine this. You're handed a silk pair with a single gold thread, meant to signify humility and thanksgiving. But no one tells you they were woven by an expelled artisan from Granada whose work was rumored to trap heat as punishment. So halfway through your first leap, your foot feels like it's in a roasted fig. You can't stop. You can't adjust. You just smile through clenched teeth and pretend it's artistic intensity. Dancers feared these ceremonial socks not because of their look, but because of their past. Fringe belief held that ceremonial pairs absorbed the mood of their previous performance. A pair worn during a failed wedding match was thought to carry that misfortune into its next outing. Some dancers would even insist their ceremonial socks be smoked over rosemary fires to banish residual emotion. Dramatic? Yes. But imagine if every time you wore a sweater, it remembered your last breakup, and there were strict rules on who could wear what. Young, unmarried dancers were forbidden from wearing green hose on St. John as Eve. It was associated with fertility and would invite scandal. Married dancers were advised against red silk at Epiphany celebrations, as it might distract the Magi. You squint at that one. Who knew the wise men were so easily thrown off? Even socks lengths carried meaning. Longer hose, reaching mid-thigh, signified maturity and mastery, reserved for dancers who had survived 10 festival seasons without incident. Shorter ankle styles were for novices or symbolic, humble offerings. Wearing the wrong length could be seen as either arrogance or shame. One tale tells of a young dancer scolded for wearing thigh-length socks at a rural festival. "You haven't earned the knee," the priest allegedly shouted. Historians still argue whether this layering of symbolism was enforced by the church or cultivated by the dancers themselves as a self-regulating system. Some scholars suggest that the obsession with ceremonial sock protocol was a way for dancers to assert identity within rigid class structures. Others believe it was plain old fear of punishment, embarrassment, or being blamed for a botched ritual. Whatever the reason, these socks became characters in their own right. Some even had names. Yes, really. A famous pair known as Las Orugas. The Caterpillars was said to jinx every dancer who wore them with minor injuries. Another pair, El Silencio, was worn exclusively for morning dances and was kept sealed in a beeswax-lined box between uses. You try not to picture socks whispering at night. Try harder. And here's a little-known tidbit. Ceremonial socks were often reused across generations, becoming heirlooms of sorts. Passed down from aunt to niece, from teacher to pupil, each pair gathered legends. One family in northern Castile preserved a single left sock, just the left, as a relic of a dancer who had vanished mid-performance. No one knew if she'd run away, been abducted, or simply gotten lost behind a tapestry. But the sock remained, and every few years someone would perform wearing only the right foot covered to complete the story. Now you step aside as the dancers file out into the gathering dusk. Each pair of ceremonial socks has been chosen, blessed, fluffed, and, perhaps, reluctantly accepted. There are no protests tonight. Only a few worried glances at toe seams and suspiciously crunchy heels. The bells begin to ring. The crowd murmurs. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows way past bedtime. The ceremony is about to begin. And you, watching from the edges, now understand. These dancers don't fear socks because they're silly. They fear them because in this world of pageantry and precision, the tiniest detail could unravel everything. A crooked seam, a cursed thread, a whisper in the silk. Enough to turn a celebration into a cautionary tale. So tonight, every step is measured, every turn is rehearsed, and every sock is worn like armor. The first drumbeat strikes like a heartbeat across the plaza, and instantly, every dancer is electric. You don't see nerves, no fidgeting or final sock checking now. Just stillness, tension, the moment before movement. Then, like leaves whipped by a sudden gust, they erupt into motion. To an outsider, it looks seamless, controlled chaos in shimmering waves. But you, newly initiated into the cult of sock superstition, spot the tells. That one dancer with her feet angled ever so carefully away from the priest, that other one avoiding the left side of the fountain, and the third, clearly fighting the rising itch of wool socks she clearly hates but fears to swap. Tonight's performance follows a strict pattern of choreography tied to ancient superstitions. You see, in many medieval Spanish towns, especially in regions with strong Moorish and Christian overlaps, dances weren't just entertainment. They were ritual. Mainstream historical fact. Some Spanish dances, like the Danza de Espadas, sword dance, or La Morisca, were often used during religious holidays, and political celebrations with movement sequences mimicking battle, prayer, or historical reenactments. Dancers didn't just improvise. They performed tradition, steps handed down like sacred recipes. And within those rigid patterns, superstition crept like ivy. A few key moves were considered high risk for attracting misfortune. The infamous triple pivot with toe tap was avoided during Lent because it resembled a Moorish war signal. Backward sweeping arches were banned from dances in Catalonia for decades, said to invite bad harvests. Historians still argue whether these bans were based on real taboos or invented by overzealous parish leaders trying to keep things tidy. But nothing stirred more fear than the sock rip. You know the sound. A slow pull, a sickening pop, a ripped seam mid-performance. It meant more than embarrassment. It was a curse omen. In some regions, they'd stop the entire performance and force a prayer circle around the dancer. In others, the show would continue, but that dancer was expected to leave the town before sunrise. One record from 1378 mentions a girl whose sock tore during a Holy Week dance. Locals blamed her for a hailstorm the next day. Another dancer, in a different region, was celebrated after catching her sock mid-slip and weaving it back on with thread from her sash, mid-performance. She was gifted a chicken for her bravery. The bar was strange back then. But what really fascinates you is the way foot positioning became another layer of magical thinking. Performers believed that stepping with your left foot first invited darkness, especially if the first beat of the music was in a minor key. Others swore by starting on the right foot only if the moon was waxing. They'd debate these points like weather-obsessed sailors or astrologers comparing birth charts. A dancer in Salamanca once wrote a note tucked in her sock, "If left, then moon. If right, then sun. May I fall on neither," which, honestly, would make a great tattoo. These beliefs influenced rehearsal etiquette, too. Whole troupes had pre-performance rituals where they'd spin counterclockwise once, jump twice, then knock their heels together as if exercising something. Some historians believe this was based on old Iberian folk traditions. Others think it was just dancers trying to psych themselves up while pretending not to be terrified. And the most fringe tidbit? The sock line. In certain guilds, dancers would draw a faint line inside their socks using crushed berries or ink. If the line vanished after the performance, they believed they were protected by a saint. If the line stayed, bad omen. You try not to giggle. Imagine modern athletes sniffing their socks for divine intervention. But for these medieval artists, performance wasn't just pressure, it was survival. A flawless dance could win you patronage, protection, or marriage proposals. A failed one might mean banishment, ridicule, or worse, being replaced by your younger cousin. So if a particular choreography felt unlucky, it wasn't worth the risk. One troupe reportedly changed their entire festival routine because a previous dancer had sprained her ankle mid-turn. Twice. "The saints have spoken," they declared. "No turns this year." Instead, they added claps. Lots of claps. The audience loved it. You notice how the dancers' feet seem to skim rather than stomp. It's not just grace, it's preservation. Each knows which move to honor, which one to alter subtly, and which to flat-out skip. Their bodies whisper centuries of instruction. Don't tap 3 times here. Don't step inside the fountain ring. don't face the cathedral gate while leaping. Just don't. Even the fabric responds. You watch a dancer do a low spin, her socks folding perfectly at the ankle. No crease, no sag. You've heard murmurs about trained socks, pairs worn so often they seem to mold themselves to the foot as path. One dancer called hers obedient. Another simply nodded and said, "They know the dance." What's amazing isn't just that these traditions survived, but that they evolved. Over time, troops started creating sock rules specific to their group. Red for festivals, blue for mourning. No polka dots ever. Apparently, polka dots were cursed with cheer. One guild even had an official sockmaster. Their job? Inspect the footgear before every show and bless any suspicious pairs with oil and a sharp look. And you think your old gym teacher was strict. As the dance nears its end, a slow, sweeping motion passes across the line of performers. Their feet seem to float in sync, skimming across the cobblestones. You imagine the ancient dancers watching from some candlelit purgatory, nodding with approval. No socks ripped, no toes caught, no omens summoned. At least, not yet. The crowd erupts with polite applause, the kind that's more about reverence than ruckus. In the flickering lantern light, the dancers bow with a practiced fluidity, careful not to let their socks twist or slide. You swear you see one glance nervously at her left foot, like it might betray her at any moment. But the real performance is only half over. Behind the scenes, down narrow stairwells and through smoky stone corridors, begins the sock removal ritual. And no, it's not just take them off and toss them in a basket. In this world, post-dance protocol is almost as feared as the stage itself. You follow the procession into a cloistered dressing chamber where candles gutter low and cool air carries the scent of sweat, incense, and something vaguely sheep-like. Dancers seat themselves carefully on wooden stools. No one speaks yet. The socks come off one by one. This is the sock-shedding hour. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval Spanish festivals often ended with private rituals for performers, especially those involved in sacred or symbolic dances. In some cases, these involved prayer, silence, or offerings meant to close the performance space and prevent any lingering energy from affecting the participants' lives afterward. For dancers, especially women, the sock removal moment was a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief, because they could finally breathe again. Wool fibers be gone. Anxiety, because if something went wrong during removal, the consequences could ripple into their personal lives. A twisted sock might mean an impending argument. A stuck heel could signal heartbreak. Historians still argue whether these beliefs originated from ancient fertility rites or simple paranoia. You notice one dancer carefully folding her socks inward, so the soles never face upward. This was said to keep the journey sacred, as soles were considered intimate, almost profane. Another places her socks gently on a carved shelf with a carved sun above it. She makes the sign of the cross. You think she's done, but no. She blows on them, 3 short puffs, like she's extinguishing candles. Fringe tidbit? Some dancers believed that socks retained footprints of emotion. One troupe required each dancer to whisper the name of a saint while removing them, usually Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers. Another would only remove their socks while facing a mirror, to confuse the spirits. If you're thinking this sounds a little like sock-based exorcism, you're not alone. And there's a hierarchy, even here. The lead dancer's socks are removed by an assistant, gently, reverently, like royal slippers. Lesser dancers handle their own, but always within view of the group. An unobserved removal could be seen as suspicious. "What are you hiding?" they'd ask. One record from 1431 mentions a dancer accused of hexing a rival Ahas pair by removing hers behind a curtain and spitting into the heel. You glance at the socks themselves. Some are already curling at the edges, like they're tired too. You wonder how many performances each pair has seen. how many festivals they've survived. Some are likely stitched and restitched so many times. Their original thread is long gone, like the medieval version of your grandfather E.S. axe. The handle, yes, new, and the blade, S, been replaced, but it's still his axe. The room slowly begins to shift from ritual to routine. One dancer oils her legs with lavender to seal the energy. Another fans her feet to dry them properly before placing them back in their cloth pouch. You notice that no socks are simply tossed aside. Even the most threadbare pair is folded, respected, placed carefully back into its own little cloth bag, as if it might bite you otherwise. Then comes the inventory check. A senior dancer with a tablet of thin wood walks around the chamber, calling out names. Each dancer presents their socks, says how they felt, and whether any signs were observed. Loose thread, one says solemnly. Sharp stone caught near toe seam, another mutters. Heel too quiet, says a third. Wait, heel too quiet? Apparently, yes. Some dancers believed that properly attuned socks made the right amount of sound, enough to announce your steps without disrupting the music. A silent sock was suspicious, perhaps cursed by silence. You resist the urge to roll your eyes, but also, maybe that dancer has a point, quiet feet do sound like sneaky feet. Some socks are declared safe, others are marked for cleansing. A few are banished entirely, rolled into tight knots and placed into a locked cedar box known only as el ataúd de los pies, the coffin of the feet. You wouldn't be shocked if it had a tiny latch and an even tinier scream. But even here, in this sleepy afterglow of ritual, there's laughter. A dancer jokes about almost losing a sock mid-jump. Another shows off a large hole shaped like the Virgin Mary. A third claims her sock spontaneously switched feet. No one believes her, but she's funny, and the tension lifts a little. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about actual belief or shared performance anxiety. Some say the sock obsession functioned like modern sports superstitions, lucky socks, game day routines. Others argue it was a form of bodily autonomy in a world where women's clothing and behavior were tightly regulated. The sock became a space of control, of agency, and perhaps it still is. You're tempted to ask one of the dancers if she believes any of it. The whispering soles, the blessed heels, the biting seams. But as she slides her pair into a satin pouch and kisses the ribbon tied around them, you realize. You already know her answer. Finally, the bells ring one last time, signaling the end of the night. The dancers rise, re-robed, slippers back on, and file out into the quiet streets of the village. You linger, watching the now empty stools and folded pairs waiting in silence. You wonder if they dream. You wonder if they remember the steps better than their owners. Maybe tomorrow, when the festival continues, they'll be assigned to new feet. Maybe they'll protest, subtly. A wrinkle here, a squeak there. Just enough to remind you who really runs the show. The night air cools your skin as you step outside the cloistered chamber, the sounds of the festival fading into a gentle hum behind thick stone walls. You can still hear the soft shuffle of dancers' feet retreating to their lodgings, whispering good nights as their sock pouches clink softly with the weight of worn wool. The moon hangs low and lazy above the tiled rooftops, casting pale silver light over the sleepy town. You trudge down a narrow alley lined with shuttered shops, remnants of festive banners fluttering in the evening breeze. Your thoughts drift to the curious way these dancers live, bound by rituals both sacred and superstitious. How odd it must feel to be constantly mindful of something as simple as socks, an everyday item transformed into a symbol of fate. This preoccupation with sock lore actually echoes a wider medieval obsession with textiles and clothing. Garments were more than protection against weather. They were markers of identity, power, and status. The dye in your tunic, the cut of your hose, even the embroidery on your socks could dictate how you were perceived. Wearing the wrong color, or worse, the wrong socks, might invite social disdain or even accusations of witchcraft. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Spain, sumptuary laws strictly regulated what people could wear, depending on their class and occupation. Certain fabrics and colors were reserved for nobility, while common folk were restricted to coarse wool or linen. Socks were no exception. Fine. Dyed socks could signify wealth and prestige, sometimes even political allegiance, but the sock superstitions went beyond mere fashion policing. In some villages, you learn that socks were believed to harbor the essence of the wearer's spirit. To lose or damage your socks was to risk losing part of yourself. One strange custom involved burning the socks of a deceased loved one during funeral rites, releasing their spirit on its journey. This brings us to a fringe tidbit. Some dancers claimed their socks could absorb emotions. After a tense rehearsal or a fierce argument, they would wash their socks in scented water or bury them overnight beneath a fig tree to cleanse bad energy. A few even believed socks could carry curses and would trade them secretly like talismans. Historians still argue whether these practices originated from pagan beliefs lingering beneath Christian practices or were simply practical ways to maintain communal order and mental well-being. Some think it was a way to create control over the uncontrollable. In a time when illness, war, and famine loomed large, perhaps controlling your socks felt like controlling fate. As you walk past a quiet fountain, you see a faint imprint on the cobblestones, a patch where the stones seem smoother, worn by countless feet. You imagine the countless dancers who have stepped here, each carefully aligning their socks, weaving their feet through patterns older than the stones themselves. Their lives, fears, and hopes are stitched invisibly into the very fabric of this place. You pause, your own socks brushing the ground, and wonder, if these socks could tell stories, what tales would yours whisper? And as the night deepens, you tuck that thought away and let the gentle rhythm of the town lull you onward. The dawn creeps slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with bruised purples and soft pinks. You find yourself wandering toward the town square, where the aftermath of the Night Tunas Dancing Festival still lingers in the air like the faint scent of burnt rosemary and sweet wine. The cobblestones glisten with morning dew, and the occasional stray sock, forgotten or intentionally left, rests in a quiet corner, a silent witness to the night's ceremonies. You can help but notice how socks in this medieval Spanish town are far from mere foot coverings. They are symbolic battlegrounds where superstition, artistry, and everyday life collide. While the dancers' rituals are elaborate, the common folk have their own curious relationships with socks, often linked to health and luck. Historically speaking, medieval medicine was, well, a bit of a mess. Plagues, fevers, and aches ran rampant, and remedies ranged from the sensible to the outright bizarre. One mainstream fact: people believed that wearing woolen socks infused with certain herbs could ward off illness or ease symptoms. Lavender, sage, and rosemary were favorites tucked into socks or stitched into the seams. This was practical. Herbs have antiseptic properties, but also a comforting superstition in a world with few real cures. There's a quirky tidbit that makes you smile. Apparently, in some Spanish villages, newlyweds exchanged socks as part of their wedding ceremony. The bride and groom would each wear one of the other's socks, symbolizing the mingling of their lives and fortunes. Forget the fancy rings. This sock exchange was the real sign that you were stitched together for life. And yes, historians still argue whether this custom was more about symbolic unity or simply a practical way to ensure each partner had clean socks. You also discover an unexpected sock-related superstition about dancing. Some villagers believed that if you accidentally showed your bare ankle during a dance, it could curse your partner with bad luck or even heartbreak. Socks, and the way they framed the ankle, were therefore crucial to protecting not just your feet, but your romantic destiny. You can imagine the pressure on dancers to keep those socks perfectly in place while spinning and leaping. In fact, many dancers used hidden stitches and tiny weights sewn into their socks to help maintain balance and prevent slips. It sounds like a precursor to the modern-day tap shoe, but with less jazz hands and more whispered warnings. Some even believed that socks could sing underfoot if stitched right, adding a secret rhythm to the music. Historians still debate whether these sock superstitions were largely invented by the dancers themselves to add mystique and control to their craft, or if they grew naturally from widespread folk beliefs. Either way, the result was a rich tapestry of practices that turned something as mundane as socks into objects of power. As you stand there, socks tucked neatly inside your own worn boots, you feel a new appreciation for these humble garments. In medieval Spain, they weren't just for warmth, they were woven into the very soul of the dance, the ritual, and the life lived beneath the flickering torchlight. As the sun climbs higher, you find yourself drawn toward the bustling market near the town's heart. Here, merchants hawk bright fabrics, embroidered trims, and, most importantly, socks of all kinds. The clamor of voices mingles with the scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh bread. This market is a crossroads where everyday needs meet the flair of medieval fashion. You watch as a vendor unfurls his wares. Rows of wool, silk, and linen socks dyed in rich hues, red, green, gold, colors that would have made the average villager's eyes widen with envy. Socks here aren't just practical, they're statements. The more intricate the weave, the more you showed your place in society. Nobles favored silk and fine embroidery, while peasants stuck to thick, durable wool. Mainstream historical fact: sumptuary laws in medieval Spain dictated not only who could wear what, but extended even to socks. The laws were rigid enough that wearing the wrong color or fabric could lead to fines or public shame. Socks, in this context, became a kind of social currency, a tiny textile badge of honor or shame. You overhear a curious conversation between two women haggling over a pair of bright red socks. One claims they're enchanted to bring good fortune in dance competitions. The other retorts, "Those are just dyed with henna. Fool's luck at best." It's a lively exchange, and it reminds you how much sock lore intermingled with everyday beliefs. Here is a quirky tidbit. Some sellers were rumored to stitch secret messages or symbols into the fabric of socks, tiny knots or colored threads forming patterns invisible to the untrained eye. These coded socks served as clandestine signals, sometimes for lovers, other times for political rebels. The idea of talking socks might sound silly, but for some, it was a serious form of communication. Historians still debate whether these hidden sock messages were widespread or merely isolated folk tales blown out of proportion. The lack of surviving physical evidence leaves this a tantalizing mystery wrapped in wool. As you walk through the market, you notice a young dancer carefully selecting a pair of socks, choosing not only for style but for energy balance, as she puts it. You smile at her seriousness, thinking back to the rituals and superstitions you've encountered. Socks here are more than just clothing. They're armor, talismans, and companions on the dance floor. With a final glance at the colorful stalls, you tuck a small coin into the vendor's hand and step back into the rhythm of the town. The sock story continues, thread by thread, step by step. The afternoon sun casts long shadows as you follow a narrow street winding toward the dance hall, its wooden beams creaking softly in the warm breeze. Inside, you catch the faint murmur of practice, a steady beat, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional burst of laughter. The dancers prepare for tonight's performance, their movements precise, their socks a vital part of the ritual. You notice how much care goes into choosing the right socks for a dance. It's not just about color or fabric, it's about fit, feel, and even scent. The dancers believe that socks can carry the energy of previous performances, and some swear by their lucky pairs, worn only on special occasions. You might chuckle at the idea of socks having moods, but here, it feels oddly believable. One mainstream historical fact stands out. Medieval dancers in Spain often wore layered clothing to allow freedom of movement while maintaining modesty. Socks were sometimes reinforced with leather patches to prevent wear, especially on the heels and toes. This practical innovation speaks to a blend of artistry and functionality. Dancers needed to move swiftly without their socks betraying them. There's a quirky tidbit that adds a twist. Some dancers believed that the threads used to stitch socks could influence their performance. Red thread was thought to bring passion and vigor, while blue could calm nerves. A few even embedded tiny charms inside the hems, bits of bone, herbs, or beads, to invoke protection or good luck. Historians still argue whether these beliefs originated with the dancers or were borrowed from broader folk traditions. Some suggest the practices helped performers mentally prepare, functioning as early forms of ritualistic psyching up. You watch a young woman carefully dabbing lavender water on her socks before slipping on her dancing shoes. The scent is subtle but calming, weaving through the humid air. She tells you it's an old tradition, meant to keep away the evil eye and bad luck during performances. Interestingly, dancers were also wary of sock mishaps. A sudden tear or loose thread during a routine was seen as an ominous sign. Some believed it predicted injury or heartbreak. This fear made them meticulous about repairs, often stitching their socks late into the night by candlelight. As the rehearsal intensifies, you feel the pulse of the dance reverberate through the floorboards. The socks, hidden beneath swirling skirts and sturdy shoes, are silent partners in every step and leap. They carry stories of superstition, survival, and the sheer human need to find meaning in the smallest details. You smile, realizing that these socks, humble and worn, are much more than fabric. They're threads woven through history itself. The golden light of late afternoon filters through stained glass windows as you step into a quiet chapel tucked behind the dance hall. The air is thick with incense and the faint hum of whispered prayers. Here, faith and folklore entwine in unexpected ways, and even socks are not exempt from spiritual significance. You learn that dancers often sought blessings for their socks before big performances. A priest might sprinkle holy water on the wool, invoking protection against injury and misfortune. This melding of religious ritual with everyday superstition feels like a delicate dance itself, a balancing act between piety and tradition. Historically, medieval Spain was a mosaic of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures, each bringing its own beliefs about clothing and luck. The idea of blessed garments was widespread. Pilgrims wore holy cloths, and knights bore embroidered symbols for divine favor. Socks, though humble, sometimes became part of this spiritual armor. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some dancers believed that if their socks were blessed during a full moon, the protective power was amplified. They would schedule their laundry and dressing rituals to align with lunar cycles, convinced that moonlight infused their socks with mystical energy. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, yet these lunar practices were quite real. Historians still debate whether these lunar rituals were remnants of older pagan customs surviving under the Christian veneer, or simply creative additions by dancers seeking control over unpredictable lives. Either way, the convergence of faith, superstition, and dance is striking. You notice a small wooden box in the chapel corner, filled with worn socks donated by dancers as offerings or thanks for protection. Each pair carries a silent story of triumph or escape from harm. It's a humble yet profound testament to how deeply woven socks were into the lives and spirits of these performers. As you leave the chapel, the faintest scent of rosemary lingers on your skin, mingling with the echoes of whispered prayers and muted footsteps. It feels as though the very air remembers the countless dancers who came here seeking solace for their souls and their socks. You can't help but feel a gentle awe for this peculiar tradition, a reminder that even the smallest threads can carry great meaning when wrapped around the human heart. Twilight descends softly over the village, the sky a deepening canvas of indigo and silver stars. You find yourself back near the dance hall, where the evening's performance is about to begin. The murmurs of the crowd swell, and the scent of burning sage curls through the air. Tonight, the dancers will put their socks to the ultimate test. Grace, stamina, and superstition intertwined in every step. You slip quietly into a shadowed corner and watch as the performers prepare. Their socks, carefully selected and blessed, peek out from beneath their flowing skirts and trousers. You sense a tension, not just from the physical demands of the dance, but from the weight of ancient beliefs resting on these humble garments. Historically, public dance performances in medieval Spain were both entertainment and social ritual, occasions where communities gathered to celebrate, court, and communicate. The dancers were respected and feared, their movements said to influence fortune and fate. Socks, it turns out, were considered essential to this power. Here, as a quirky detail, some dancers believed that socks worn inside out during a performance could confuse evil spirits or bad luck, tricking them into leaving the dancer unharmed. It, as a practical superstition wrapped in a layer of whimsy. Who hasn't he accidentally put a sock on backward and felt a twinge of guilt? Historians still debate whether this inside-out sock practice was widespread or simply an isolated folk belief that spread through storytelling. Regardless, it highlights the creative ways dancers sought control over unpredictable forces. As the music begins, the dancers take the floor. The rhythmic tapping of their feet echoes like a heartbeat through the hall. You notice how each sock seems to tell its own story, through patches, worn spots, and colors, as much a part of the performance as the dancer's expressions. Suddenly, a dancer's sock catches on the wooden floor, a thread pulling free. The crowd gasps softly, and you feel the ripple of superstition tighten in the air. The dancer pauses, a flicker of worry crossing their face, then carefully adjusts the sock before continuing. The dance resumes, now charged with even more intensity. You realize that these socks are silent witnesses to human frailty and resilience, symbols of the delicate balance between fate and free will. Tonight, as the dancers weave their stories through motion and fabric, you sense the deep, unspoken bond between them and their socks, a bond that transcends mere superstition and touches something profoundly human. As the performance ends, the applause is warm but hushed, a shared acknowledgement of the mystery and magic woven into every step and every stitch. Night deepens, and the village grows quiet again, the echoes of the dance still whispering through empty streets. You linger by a flickering lantern outside the dance hall, where dancers relax, peeling off layers and revealing the socks that have carried them through the night's trials. Each pair tells a story of sweat, hope, and superstition stitched into worn fabric. You reflect on how something as simple as socks shaped lives, rituals, and fears in medieval Spain. These garments weren't just accessories. They were symbols of identity, protection, and connection, a textile language spoken through color, stitch, and wear. A mainstream fact comes to mind. Textiles were among the most valuable possessions in medieval households. Socks, though small, required skill, time, and precious materials. Their care and maintenance were acts of devotion and practicality rolled into one. Here is a quirky note to ponder. Some dancers kept secret, emergency socks hidden in their clothing, fresh pairs stitched with special threads and blessed for quick changes. Losing a sock mid-dance was not only embarrassing but believed to invite misfortune, so preparedness was key. Historians still debate whether these emergency socks were a widespread practical measure or part of an elaborate folklore surrounding dance superstition. The truth, like many medieval tales, is probably a blend of both. As you watch the dancers fold their socks carefully, treating them almost like sacred relics, you realize that these simple items encapsulate a world where everyday objects were infused with deeper meaning. Socks became talismans, stories, and companions on a journey both physical and spiritual. You smile softly, imagining the footsteps that have passed through centuries, worn socks pressing into dusty floors and polished stages alike. The dance continues, an eternal rhythm that ties the past to the present, one step and one stitch at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.